Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We are just about to start with the webinar and we are waiting for everybody to log in. Let's give it 4 minutes remaining. At the right time, we will be able to start. And I'm going to hand over everything to you, Danielin. When it's the time, then you can start. Just for now, to alert everybody that everything is set. We are just waiting for numbers to grow. I see numbers are growing as we speak right now. Thank you so much. Danielin, it is exactly 2 o'clock. I'm handing over everything to you. Good luck, enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to introduce myself firstly. My name is Danieline Fransman. I'm the Chief Director, Social Justice and Participatory Democracy at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. I will be directing the program today. And my first task in that regard is just to welcome you, as I said, and to open the proceedings. So in that regard, thank you very much. I can see that there's a number of people still joining, for making time to join what we hope to be a very interactive discussion and robust engagement today. We are honored to have guests from various institutions, from government, civil society sector, Chapter 9, UN agencies, a number of key stakeholders, partners, and of course to welcome our colleagues. As a department, we are certainly very honored to host this event, looking at some very topical issues. Looking at the program, it is about anti-immigrant sentiments in the current South African context. And the program today will start firstly with background, setting the scene, and a bit of a purpose to the webinar by the Deputy Director General of the department, whom I will introduce. This will be followed by a presentation from the HSRC, with whom we are partnering today. And following that, there will be a response by a number of government departments, represented by some of the panelists there, and we will then have a moderated question and answer session looking at the way forward, practical recommendations, and whereafter we will then close. And also a special welcome and thank you then to our colleagues from the South African Human Rights Commission and the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, who will be delivering messages of support for today's event. So I will introduce the colleagues as they speak. We have a program that is running for about around setting the scene and the purpose of the webinar. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Laffoy.
Good afternoon to all of our esteemed guests, our stakeholders, and our colleagues and partners from all the various sectors, including government, our Chapter 9 institutions, civil society, and all of our colleagues. Today's event forms part of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development's activities to commemorate this year's Human Rights Month during March under the theme, The Year of Charlotte Baxeke, Promoting Human Rights in the Age of COVID-19. And as Janeline Fransman has already pointed out, the issues being addressed today are topical given the current context and climate. This webinar is being held against the backdrop of recent spates of xenophobic violence in the country, in which both South African and non-nationals were attacked and killed. Following this recent violence, various hotspots have been identified throughout the country, including in KwaZulu-Natal, Gauteng, and parts of the Western and Eastern Cape. In immediate response to these attacks, the South African government worked closely with civil society and faith-based organizations to formulate an appropriate humanitarian response. From a policy viewpoint, the National Action Plan to Combat Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance is South Africa's primary policy tool to deal with issues of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. This National Action Plan Against Racism, which I will refer to in short as the NAP, going forward, was developed in response to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which was adopted exactly 20 years ago at the World Conference Against Racism held in Durban. The WCA, as presented in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, states, we recognize that racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance on the grounds of race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, and that victims can suffer multiple or aggravated forms of discrimination based on other related grounds such as sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, social origin, property, birth, or other status. The DDPA urges states to establish and implement without delay national action policies and plans to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. The NAP furthermore gives effect to our international human rights obligations under conventions such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, or the ICIRD. The country report under the ICIRD has recently been deposited at the UN by the Department of Justice. In addition to giving effect to our regional and international human rights obligations, government policy and legislation in this area is grounded in our right to equality and the right to be protected from discrimination, which features prominently in our Constitution. It's often said that the South African Constitution is one of the most progressive in the world and enjoys high acclaim internationally. This Constitution lays the basis for the creation of a society in which the celebration of cultural diversity contributes towards the creation of a unifying social and national identity. All persons in South Africa share a basic set of human rights under both domestic and international law, regardless also marks the 25th anniversary of the South African Constitution. The celebration of this historic marker provides an opportunity not only for celebration, but also for reflection. In the words of Chief Justice Sandile Ngobo, the primary goal that we have set for ourselves in the Constitution is to establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Let us pause and consider what has been attained so that we may refocus our efforts on this 25th anniversary to ensure that we establish constitutionalism, human rights, and the rule of law as the bedrock of our democracy. In pursuit of this goal, the NAP constitutes South Africa's national plan to eradicate racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance. The NAP and its 5-year indicative implementation plan were approved by Cabinet on the 27th of February 2019, officially launched and deposited with the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights on the 2nd of July 2019. This 5-year program of action is closely aligned to government's medium-term strategic framework, and particular to Priority 6, Social Cohesion and Safe Communities, which gives expression to Chapter 15 of our National Development Plan, Vision 2030. The Department of Justice and Constitutional Development remains the NAP focal agency as tasked by Cabinet, with responsibility to lead and coordinate the implementation of the NAP. In addition to its role as focal agency responsible for coordinating the overall implementation of the NAP, the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and mainly via the branch Constitutional Development, is directly responsible for a number of actions and measures in the NAP POA. And it's these actions and measures that are linked to this webinar today and to the research which we will be discussing. The NAP includes an objective relating to the promotion of research strategies to determine the impact of the NAP on levels of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. So related to evidence-based policy making, we have a specific indicator aligned to this objective, which requires us to collaborate with research institutions to conduct research on racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, and other related intolerances. Another relevant objective is the promotion of social cohesion, as mentioned earlier. And in line with this, we work to conduct anti-xenophobia campaigns in collaboration with our various stakeholders and role players. And our strategic partners, we roll out social mobilization campaigns to address racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and intolerance. We in the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, and the Constitutional Development Branch in particular, are very pleased to be collaborating with the Human Sciences Research Council, as well as the GCIS, in conducting this webinar in support of the NAP, which is located also within our commemorative activities for Human Rights Month. The Human Sciences Research Council recently conducted a survey that was published on 16th of October 2020 in partnership with its market research partner, Ipsos. The survey was conducted with a view to understanding how refugees, asylum seekers, and cross-border migrants are viewed in the country. This anti-immigrant survey is therefore crucial to assist the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, indeed government and civil society, to develop and implement targeted public education campaigns and other initiatives which can reshape attitudes, behaviors, and perceptions towards foreign nationals. Importantly, this survey aimed to fill a gap in the lack of data, which is often a deterrent to effective and targeted initiatives aimed at combating anti-immigrant sentiments. This is in line with the NAP and will assist the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development and other public policymakers to engage in discourse that will propose measures on how to more effectively eliminate xenophobic tensions in South African society in line with the National Action Plan Against Racism. With this backdrop in mind, we welcome all our esteemed stakeholders to this presentation by Dr. Stephen Gordon, the researcher from the Human Sciences Research Council, on the findings and recommendations from the research paper. We are also pleased to be joined by Advocate Bongani Majola, Chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission, and Mr. Zulu from the UNHCR, who will share a few words with us prior to the presentation of the research findings. Advocate Majola, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lafoy. My name is Bongani Majola at the South African Human Rights Commission. I have just a few words to share with you in the form of a message of support. It is indeed very heartwarming for us as the South African Human Rights Commission to be invited to this webinar that seeks to address the anti-immigrant sentiment in our country. As you know, this is one of the major problems that we've had to deal with since before 2008. As you might well be aware, the South African Human Rights Commission seeks, therefore, to promote the rights of all who live in the country, in accordance with the principles of equality, freedom, and non-discrimination that are highlighted in our Constitution. The Commission is particularly pleased to note that one of the objectives of Human Rights Month 2021, as developed by the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, is to use the month as the vehicle to foster social cohesion, nation building, national identity, socio-economic development, end to racism, Afrophobia, xenophobia, and homophobia. The term social cohesion has been defined and conceptualized by a number of social scientists, but this term was eloquently simplified in the book, quote, Lord of the Flies, which was written by William Golding. The book describes how 4 little boys who were stranded on an island worked together as a single organism to survive very difficult odds. Working together as a single organism is the kind of spirit which needs to be fostered across South Africa in order for us to overcome the many odds we face as a country. Dr. Mo Ibrahim alluded to the importance of social cohesion in his keynote address at the Nelson Mandela annual lecture when he said, quote, I believe social cohesion is really about holding our society together. It is about building a national identity that transcends ethnic, religious, class, and gender. It is more than just a passport or an ID. It is where we achieve common purpose as citizens, and when we really feel that we have equitable access and participation in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of our country. It is not about entitlement. but about equal opportunities and hope. It is about dialogue, listening, and talking the Madiba way, end quote. The Commission thus supports the collaboration of the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development with the Human Sciences Research Council and the National Action Plan to conduct research to not only examine anti-immigrant attitudes and behaviors that lead to xenophobia, but also to assist in creating anti-xenophobic campaigns. The Commission further supports this webinar, which is organized in partnership with GCIS with the objective to develop a policy brief which will inform government programs in the implementation of the National Action Plan. I would like, therefore, to express appreciation collaboration with a prominent research institution that we witnessed today. It is indeed a known fact that to achieve I thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission, for those kind words and message of support. And I will now call on Mr. Leonard Zulu, Resident Coordinator from the UNHCR South Africa, to please deliver your message. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, the Department of Justice, for inviting UNHCR to convey its support for this very important report that has been written, the survey, and we look forward to the presentation. I wanted to start by underlining the fact that refugees are often the victims of racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination in their countries of origin, and hence they flee because of violence, conflict, or persecution to a place of safety. And South Africa has, for many refugees, today we count over 260,000, has been a place of refuge for people who flee racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination. And that is very important to underline right from the start, especially during South Africa's month on Human Rights Month. I would also underline that most of them have found safety, security, and an opportunity to found families and raise their children here in South Africa. And for that, UNHCR really appreciates the values enshrined in the Constitution of South Africa, epitomized by the host community, the people of South Africa, in taking care of asylum seekers and refugees, and also the government for having an open door policy, a good legal framework anchored in the Constitution, and also being able to allow refugees to enjoy services, health, education, and many other rights in South Africa, human rights in South Africa, enjoy them on par with the citizens of South Africa. Of course, like any human endeavor or human beings living side by side, there are challenges in the communities, and that we know. Whenever we have violence against foreigners, refugees and asylum seekers are caught up in this. And unfortunately, in our work together with the Human Rights Commission of South Africa, this is something that we are constantly engaged with, and also with the Department of Justice as we co-chair the Protection Working Group that looks closely at this issue within the framework of the National Action Plan that was mentioned. And that's a very important blueprint on how we can address this problem. The problem that we are discussing today of anti-immigrant sentiment in the context of South Africa. And I must also underline that this is not unique to South Africa. This is found in many countries, if not all countries of the world. So our task is really to constantly work on social cohesion with the relevant government bodies, the departments involved in this, to work with the people in the community, in the townships, in the rural areas, everywhere, to pass the message of tolerance and social cohesion. I also would like to say that this is not difficult to promote and to see. We've seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic measures, the lockdown, the solidarity that was demonstrated by ordinary South Africans towards refugees, refugees to refugees, or refugees to South Africans, the spirit of solidarity, of working together, of helping out your neighbor. Food parcels were handed out willingly and openly. Many charity drives were done, resources raised and handed over to neighbors so that they could pay for their rent and not be evicted. So this is something that we have seen, and we should also promote. I also I am quite confident and thankful that all refugees and asylum seekers will be included in the vaccination rollout as has been promised by the government. So the important solution for most asylum seekers that are here is local integration. They want to be part of the society in South Africa, and they are already part of the society. They are working in their communities to develop their communities to be part and parcel of the social fabric of South Africa. And that's the message really that I would like to convey, that there is hope, there is opportunity, there is also the commitment and determination to do what is good, what is right. And I think this event is a demonstration of that, and UNHCR fully supports this event. And UNHCR is with you, and together we will reach the goals that we have set ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zulu, for those very encouraging and very important words. I know that Dr. Gordon's survey and findings also do touch on the issues of local integration, but I think he will be best placed to tell us more about that. So it is now my pleasure once again to introduce Dr. Stephen Lawrence Gordon, who is a senior research specialist at the Human Science Research Council of South Africa. Dr. Gordon is also a research associate at the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Johannesburg. He has a doctorate from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as a master's degree in global studies from the University of Freiburg and a second master's degree in population studies from the University of KZN. Dr. Gordon has also worked on issues related to immigration and xenophobia since 2007. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Gordon to speak to us about the survey and provide the presentation on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. My name, as our moderator has so kindly outlined, is Stephen Gordon. I am from the Human Sciences Research Council. I would like to thank you all for attending this very important webinar on a subject of national importance. So our topic, as our moderator has indicated, is anti-immigrant sentiments in a South African context. To understand anti-immigrant sentiments is to understand the nature and context of the international migrant community, as well as the stereotypes, often unfounded and baseless, attributed to that community. So let us first start with some simple numbers. So according to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the international migrant population in South Africa is estimated to be about 4 million, about 7% of the overall national population. This represents a significant level of growth from 1990, when the population was about 1 million. South Africa is currently host to one of the largest migrant populations on the African continent. Now, in order to understand how people view this population group, we're going to be using two very important surveys. First is the Human Science Research Council's South African Social Attitude Survey. Now, this very important survey was begun in 2003. It is with adults 16 years and older living in South Africa's 9 provinces. It is a random, stratified survey that provides a nationally representative picture of the entire country, in which people from different communities all across this great land of ours were visited and interviewed face-to-face. We can talk about the survey mechanics and details a little bit more in the Q&A session. The second survey instrument we're going to be using is from Ipsos, the Ipsos Migration Survey, completed in October and November of 2019, very much like the South African Social Attitude Survey. It is a face-to-face survey, stratified, engineered to provide a representative picture. The survey was conducted in those 4 provinces where most international migrants are thought to live. This includes Limpopo, the Western Cape, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal. Now let us get to the results of these very, very important survey instruments so we can understand how people in South Africa see foreign nationals. So let us begin with public attitudes towards cross-border migrants and the consequences of immigration on South African life. So in those 4 provinces where most South Africans live, Limpopo, Western Cape, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal, we found that 64% of the adult populace believed immigration was responsible for moral decay, for disease, for unemployment. 60% thought that immigration was bad for the welfare state, that it caused social division and undermined the local economy. People attributed joblessness and low wage growth to cross-border migrants, and 64% felt that cross-border migrants increased crime levels. 44%, quite remarkably, thought that the government was prioritizing cross-border migrants when it came to state benefits. Here we can see the popularity of negative stereotypes towards the foreign national population in those places where most immigrants live. It is important at this stage to expose these stereotypes as empirically baseless. The World Bank conducted a recent study on the impact of international migration on the South African economy. It found that international migrants increase employment opportunities for locals, acting as a multiplier effect in labor markets, providing jobs in a variety of different markets. These findings were bolstered by an OECD study conducted in partnership with the International Labour Organization, which ultimately concluded that international migration had in fact raised the country's income per capita by about 5% over a 10-year period. And rather than being a major drain on the South African welfare state, paid more in taxes than they received. Indeed, South Africa's current immigration policy welcoming immigrants into the country is good for the economy, and the economy would substantially improve if more immigrants provided opportunities to work and live in South Africa. Given how popular these negative stereotypes about immigration are, we can really ask ourselves, where do people learn about foreign nationals living in our country? So as part of the South African Social Attitude Survey, the following question was put to a nationally representative sample. What is your most trusted source of information on foreign nationals? And we found overwhelmingly that television and radio were the most popular sources. Television, 66% of the adult population, radio, 51%. Is the broadcast media, which is the most trusted source of information, and therefore we must conclude that the broadcast media has failed to adequately address dangerous and unfounded stereotypes about the foreign national population. Interestingly, we found that social media and the internet was only seen by 12% as a trusted and reliable source of information on foreign nationals, suggesting that when it comes time to design anti-xenophobia communication campaigns, we need to focus on those media platforms in which most people get their information on foreign nationals, i.e. the broadcast media. It is important on this issue to note that radio was particularly popular in rural areas, far more so than television. As Leonard Zulu has clearly articulated, many South Africans are quite welcoming to foreign nationals. So here we can look at the level and type of contact people in South Africa have with foreign nationals. We see that many people have a few or some friends who are foreign nationals. Indeed, 12% of the adult population claim to have some or many friends who were foreign nationals, showing us that while some people may view international migrants in a very negative light, there is a substantial minority which is quite friendly to this population. Levels of friendship were particularly high in the Western Cape, the Northwest, and the Eastern Cape. So now let us move to public hostility and hospitality towards international migrants living in South Africa. So as part of the South African Social Attitude Survey, people were asked, which statement most applies to you? I generally welcome to South Africa all immigrants, some immigrants, no immigrants. In 2003, about a third said that they would welcome all foreigners. About a third, an equal number, said they would welcome some, and 32% said that they would welcome none. Now, over the period, the share who would welcome all has fluctuated, moving up and down. We can particularly notice a spike in 2008, a response to large-scale anti-xenophobia media campaigns in the wake of large-scale anti-immigrant violence during that period. Currently, in 2018, the era we have the latest data for, we find that 25% of the overall adult population said they would welcome all foreigners. The bulk, 47%, said they would welcome some, and 26% said that they would welcome none. This shows a nation divided on the subject of international migrants, with minorities both disliking and minorities liking foreign nationals, with a large group of people in the middle. We can compare the way South Africans viewed international migrants to the way international migrants are viewed in other parts of the African continent. So this graph here presents data from 34 African countries on whether people would dislike or like to have a foreigner as a neighbor. So we can see here that South Africa is unfortunately in the top 5 countries who exhibit the greatest intolerance towards immigrants and foreign workers. 29% of the adult public said they would not like to live next to a foreigner. This can be contrasted with 15% in Nigeria who gave the same answer and 21% in Kenya. This shows that South Africa, while not being the worst country on this score, certainly has a great deal of work to do to address levels of anti-immigrant sentiment. So let us move on and address the issue of refugees and public attitudes towards refugees. So here we look at data from the Ipsos Migration Survey. That survey conducted in those places where most immigrants live. We found that 57% of the adult population in these areas thought that refugees took the jobs of locals. 46% thought that refugees were violent. 50% thought that refugees were dishonest. Indeed, attitudes towards refugees were very similar to attitudes towards cross-border migrants, which shows that issues around immigration and issues around immigration generally cannot be separated. The way people see refugees is very similar to the way they see cross-border migrants. These are not two separate struggles, but rather part of the same struggle. How do we improve attitudes toward refugees and how do we improve attitudes towards cross-border migrants? So let's look at some public attitudes towards refugees and their impact on South African life. We found that 61% of the adult public in the 4 areas where most immigrants live feel that refugees are responsible for many problems. 57% thought that refugees were a major cause of crime. 64% thought that people lied about being refugees. 63% thought that welcoming refugees only encouraged more people to come. 57% thought that South Africa should close its borders to refugees, and 34% agreed that South Africa has a culture of solidarity and compassion. Indeed, these numbers paint quite a bleak picture, showing that many people hold strong anti-refugee sentiments. One of the most important players in South Africa in terms of helping refugees and advocating for refugees has been religious communities. Indeed, we see churches in particular playing a very strong role in this regard. However, for many people, their faith does not compel them to help cross-border migrants and refugees. Consider responses to these 2 statements. 40% of the population in the Western Cape, Gauteng, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal said that their faith compels them to help cross-border migrants, with not a lot of variation noted between the major religious groups in South Africa. Indeed, only 19% of the population in those 4 provinces felt that faith influenced their views about refugees. Again, not a lot of difference between the different religious groups in South Africa. This suggests that while faith is a very, very important institution that can help refugees and advocate for refugee rights, it is not being utilized effectively in South Africa, which many people tend to feel that their faith does not apply in this important area. Now, in this presentation so far, I have outlined public attitudes towards refugees and international migrants. But this is not enough for the design of effective anti-xenophobia interventions and strategies. To truly understand this issue, we need to categorize people into different blocks. We need to categorize people as pro-refugee, anti-refugee, and then find those groups in the middle. It is these middle groups which can be moved to a more compassionate and liberal position on refugees. In order to achieve this, Ipsos looked at 15 questions about refugees and immigration and how people in the Ipsos migration survey responded to them. And then using K-means cluster analysis, grouped people into 4 distinct categories. These are liberals, which represent about 19% of the population. These are people who are the most tolerant, the most accepting of refugees and immigrants. Then there is the careful group. These people are not overtly hostile to refugees and immigrants, but are somewhat cautious about people coming to live in South Africa. This represents about 23% of the 4 provinces under the discussion. Then there was the ambivalent cohort. These are people with no strong views about refugees and immigrants. This represents about 31% of the 4 provinces. And finally, there were the judgmental category. The judgmental category are those people who are the most hostile, the most unresponsive to refugees and immigrants. This represents about 26% of the 4 provinces under discussion. Now we can see here how these different groups are clustered across education, employment, and province. You can see that liberals are slightly more predominant amongst higher educated groups and in the Western Cape, while the judgmental category is more common amongst the less educated and in places like Limpopo. However, the level of variation here is not remarkably high, and we should contend that liberals and judgmental people can be found across the different socio-demographic fault lines of South Africa. There is no one group of people which is predominantly liberal or predominantly judgmental on this score. Now, this is not a problem of the poor. This is not a problem of one specific race group. This is a problem that South Africa needs to deal with holistically as a country. Now, we found that people who are liberal in their disposition towards refugees and immigrants tended to have more friends who were from these communities, and they tended to be married, they tended to know someone who was married to a foreigner. People who were liberal were also quite likely to know people who were hostile to refugees and cross-border migrants. People who are more judgmental, more hostile towards refugees and cross-border migrants, they tended to have much less contact, specifically much less friendly contact with these groups, and tended to only know foreigners in terms of their acquaintance. This shows the benefits of positive contact, specifically friendship contact, in moving people to a more liberal position. This is one of the many reasons why immigrant integration programs are so useful at reducing anti-immigrant sentiment, because they provide opportunities for positive contact between hosts and foreigners, allowing immigrants both to contribute to their local communities economically and socially, as well as allowing hosts to see and understand that contribution so that they have a much better opinion, not only of the specific migrants and refugees involved, but around immigration and refugeehood as a whole. We found that liberals were much more likely to help refugees in South Africa. Indeed, Leonard Zulu mentioned how helpful many people were during the COVID pandemic, giving food parcels and aid to those less fortunate than themselves. So we found that about 7% of the population in these 4 provinces had donated money, food, or other items to refugees. If we look at the liberal group, this was about 12%. We found that about 6% of this population had shared positive stories face-to-face about refugees. Amongst liberals, this was 9%. And 4% of the adult population had volunteered their time to assist refugees and help them with their daily struggles. So you can see that there is a degree of compassionate behavior and volunteer behavior in South Africa in which people do reach out and help refugees and migrants. The key really is to expand this number, specifically those willing to share positive stories, to what social psychologists call canvas for attitudinal change. Information sharing costs very little, but is extremely effective at reducing anti-immigrant sentiments. Now, amongst those groups who are the most open to changing their minds on refugees and cross-border migrants, our ambivalent and careful cohorts, we can look at which information sources they are most likely to use. We found that of these 2 groups, television, which is the most utilized source, 89% of the careful cohort trusted television for information on refugees living in South Africa, and 79% of the ambivalent cohort placed the same level of trust. Radio was less popular. 52% of the careful cohort trusted radio, and about 49% of the ambivalent cohort did the same. Newspapers were also trusted, but by only a minority, 36% of the careful cohort and 34% of the ambivalent cohort. So we can see here which information platforms need to be targeted in order to reduce anti-refugee and anti-immigrant sentiment and to move the ambivalent and careful cohorts, those most amenable to persuasion, away from a hostile position towards a more liberal and open and welcoming position. So I would like to now turn to an issue that has received quite a bit of attention in recent years, which is the issue of Afrophobia, specifically negative attitudes attributed to people from elsewhere on the African continent. So one of the ways we can assess Afrophobia is by looking at responses to the following question. So people in the South African Social Attitudes Survey were asked, which, if any, group would you least want to come and live in South Africa? Now, people listed a variety of different groups, the most popular of which were Nigerians, Zimbabweans, Somalians, and Mozambicans. No other groups stood out as more important than these. The rest of the groups mentioned have been clustered into the following categories: other African countries, global north countries like Europe or the United States, and Asian countries, China, Japan, Vietnam, etc. Now, it's immediately apparent that the group that people disliked the most were Nigerians. Nigerians received the highest level of selection in each round. This question was fielded from 2008 until 2018. More than twice as many people selected Nigerians as did Zimbabweans, selected by far fewer, although still notable 10% of the population. Examining this from an Afrophobic analytical lens, we could say that the category Nigerian has come to represent a host of negative stereotypes about people from other African countries living in South Africa. Indeed, one only has to think about the popular depictions of Nigerians in South African television and literature to truly understand how this group has come to be so synonymous with negative attributes such as crime, drug dealing, and moral decay. So we can use the Ipsos migration survey to look specifically at how people in Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal, the Western Cape, and Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal, how people in these four provinces felt about individuals from different places outside South Africa, very specific groups. So first, let's start with people from elsewhere in Africa. So Ipsos respondents were asked, to what extent do you feel connection with other people from the rest of Africa? So we can find that 27% of the adult population in these four provinces said that they felt a strong connection to people from the continent. What's interesting about the responses to this question is that white respondents, the white population in these four provinces, were slightly more likely to display a strong connection towards people from other African countries, more so than the Black African population. This suggests that the kind of Pan-Africanist connection we would hope to see from our population is not dictated by race, but rather by an ideological framework. It is also sad to see that the level of connection is often so weak amongst the general population. It is even weaker if we look at specific examples. So let's take Zimbabweans. Zimbabwe is one of South Africa's most important regional neighbors, and indeed a country which South Africa shares a long history, a country which aided South Africa during the decades of anti-apartheid liberation struggle. Yet only 14% of people in the four provinces felt a strong connection to individuals from Zimbabwe. Indeed, while some shared a weak connection, overall we can conclude that the level of connection shared between South Africa and her most important regional neighbor is very, very weak. Finally, I would like to look at attitudes towards people from Somalia. Somalis are a very vulnerable group in South Africa. Many are refugees and often are caught up in xenophobic violence. We can see, unfortunately, that a very low share of the adult population in the four provinces under discussion felt a strong connection to people from Somalia. What this slide shows us is that South Africans still have a long way to go in terms of embracing Pan-Africanist principles and ideologies. So I would like to turn now, in the final moments we have together, towards the issue of anti-immigrant hate crime. So in the South African Social Attitude Survey, we asked people about anti-immigrant hate crime. We asked them if they had engaged in violent action to prevent immigrants from living or working in their neighborhood. And the response categories were, in the past year, in the more distant past, they have not done it, but might do it, they have not done it, and would never do it. So let's look at responses to this question in 2015 to 2018. We see a small share, about 6% of the population, indicating that they had participated in violent action to prevent immigrants from living and working in their neighborhood in the past. Even more worryingly, about 11% had indicated that while they had not engaged in this behavior, they would be open towards doing so. And finally, the vast majority, about 79%, said that they had not engaged in this behavior and would not do it. What these results show us is that South Africa is not a xenophobic society, and not every South African is a xenophobe. However, a minority of people are comfortable with expressing xenophobic violence, and we're willing to engage in xenophobic violence. This shows us the scale and depth of the problem and the urgency with which we must address that problem. Of course, anti-immigrant sentiment is not only expressed in violent fashion, but is often expressed in more peaceful anti-immigrant activities. So these are the share of the population who engage in peaceful anti-immigrant activities in 2017. Verbal abuse directed at foreign nationals, boycotts of foreign-owned businesses, and demonstrations against the presence of foreigners. We can see here that specifically around the issue of demonstrations, it is of significant concern in which we have a moderate share indicating they had taken part in this kind of activity in the past, but a more significant share, about 14%, saying that they had not done so, but would be prepared to do so. It is very important when looking at this slide to recognize findings from prior HSRC research, which is that peaceful participation in anti-immigrant activities is strongly correlated with participation in violent anti-immigrant activities. Peaceful participation often degrades the norms surrounding the protection of immigrants, which results in people being more willing to engage in violence against this group. It is very, very important to track and monitor peaceful anti-immigrant activities because they are so strongly correlated with participation in violent anti-immigrant activities. When people were asked, why do individuals engage in anti-immigrant violence in South Africa? Most adult respondents utilize the anti-immigrant sentiments we've talked about in the past, blaming the violence on the job-seeking behavior of migrants, on the law-breaking behavior of migrants, on the business practices of foreigners, and on foreigners' sexual immorality. Only a minority blamed the perpetrators of violence for xenophobia in South Africa. This shows you the danger of anti-immigrant stereotypes, and how anti-immigrant stereotypes lead to victim blaming, which we blame the victims of human rights abuse rather than the perpetrators of that abuse. Victim blaming makes it hard for law enforcement to address and confront problems like this. It makes it so that victims are less liable to report their abuse, and it creates a sense in a community that such types of violence are acceptable. And finally, we ask people, what can be done to resolve anti-immigrant violence in South Africa? Now, again, many people utilized, anti-immigrant stereotypes when answering this question, calling for the expulsion of foreigners from South Africa or tighter border control as appropriate responses. However, we did find minority supports for more progressive solutions, such as education and awareness campaigns, community dialogue, as well as law enforcement, and how we build support for different anti-xenophobia interventions is a very important issue that I'd love to discuss more in the Q&A. It's important to remember that a lack of public support for a given policy or intervention can send encouraging signals to adversaries, undermine leadership, and weaken desired policy outcomes. Now, I want to thank you for our discussion. I know I've gone a little bit over time by just a few minutes, but I again would like to thank you for attending and listening to this presentation. I would like to acknowledge the hard work and dedication of the wider team who has worked on xenophobia and refugee sentiment at the Human Science Research Council over the last 10 years. Research like this could not be done without our team. And in closing, I want to pay tribute to these hardworking and passionate scholars who make research like this possible. And I turn it over to you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. I'm sure that everyone will agree that there is such rich information and data that we do need, to develop appropriate strategies to respond to these issues. So thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Gordon. As you've mentioned, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A and some discussion, which will be moderated. But first, I would like to also introduce and request colleagues from various government departments now to give their brief inputs and responses to the survey, obviously contextualized from the perspective of their mandate. I must say that we had hoped to have a number of other departments here. I mean, some of them who have quite key roles and responsibilities with regard to non-nationals and immigration and so forth. But we already had some internal discussions saying that this cannot be the first and the last of this type of engagement. So hopefully going forward, we can get more colleagues and departments on board. But the first department that I will call upon is the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture that we work with very closely. And the speaker there is Ms. Sizakele Shongwe. She's the Chief Director, Social Cohesion. Thank you so much, Ms. Shongwe. Over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Program Director. Thank you for the opportunity and in fact, the opportunity to respond. Firstly, just to say that I acknowledge the fact that our sister organization is actually hosting this webinar this afternoon in observance of Human Rights Month, which was still on and completing, so that we greatly appreciated also the partnership with the Human Sciences Research Council. I also then want to say that as well, I'd like to preface my discussion with the fact that we welcome this research study that has been presented to us. And as the program director has already said, I think there's valuable information that we have received there that we can use to strengthen and develop our programs further. Just to say as well, what I particularly liked about the study is that it will go to help us address or dispel the myth that South Africans are non-xenophobic, as we usually want to say, and to say the struggle is in terms of the limited resources. But now at least we have tangible evidence that we can use out there to back up our sentiment that we have out there. So, Program Director, allow me not to go into the detail of our reporting obligations, because everybody knows that as the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, we're responsible for reporting on Outcome 14, now known as Priority 6 on social cohesion and safe communities. And just to go on further to pick up on the issues that have been presented in the study, to say that then for me, it also sort of like vindicates me and sort of like strengthens the approach that I have had in the past, to say that one of the things that we need to do in the space of social cohesion and nation building is to strengthen the arm of research. So we have had this research that has come through, but then other areas that we need to consider as well is issues around costing social cohesion, and to see that or determine the fact that if we continue to remain divided, not united, not cohesive, what does it cost the country in terms of financial implications, in terms of the reputation and so forth. And also to say that even though we've got institutions such as the HSRC Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, but we still need to strengthen the arm of research where measuring social cohesion is concerned, also the monitoring and evaluation of social cohesion. So research is going to continue to be important in this aspect. But what I also liked from the research is that it also showed one of the elements that I've always worried about, to say that sometimes the issue is that you don't know where to find refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants, and you don't know how to find them. But we have been able to see that people mainly rely on other sources such as television, newspapers, and so forth, as opposed to the real area or arena where we would find this kind of information. And for me, this is where the communities are, traditional leadership and so forth. I think the percentage was quite low where that is concerned. So for me, it talks to the issue of integration, and to say that we need to strengthen our integration aspect to make sure that it's meaningful integration, you know, and not just integration because we want to say we're trying to bring them. Because if we're truly integrated, then it shouldn't be difficult for people to be able to get information about refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants from their very own communities. I think it also talks to another aspect that we then saw here, to say that, again, sources. Traditional leadership is not considered as one of the sources to rely on when you want to find more information. So for me, that it talks to the issues of integration. But also, I think when we also came to the issue around the solutions that are offered, you see that there isn't much that is said or supported in terms of the change of attitude and perception, issues around the dialogue, issues around law enforcement. Those are very low indeed. Whereas for me, I think that if we really want to deal with issues of immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, then you need to drill down to those things that talk about the mentality that's there, the attitudes and the perceptions, and actually delving deep into community conversations, dialogues, so that they're also meaningful. But also at another level, I think the whole study also talks to some of the things that we need to look at as a body that's out there and looking at issues of social cohesion, to say that we need to strengthen our coordination as well, so that we are going to be able to sustain the interventions that we have, and maybe move away from the start and stop and go kind of like situation. But also we need to make sure that the consultation with communities, with our beneficiaries as well, and all other stakeholders is quite consistent and constant. I think, Program Director, this is where I'd like to leave it for now. And perhaps towards the end, we'll get an opportunity to make final comments on the overall discussion that we're having today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Shongwe. I think you've also just said what I thought, that, you know, this gives us much food for thought when we go back into the new financial year again and look at how do we fine-tune our strategies and interventions exactly to change the, as you said, the attitudes and mindsets, which is one of the objectives of the Priority 6. So our next speaker will be Mr. Musa Magubane. He is the Director, Community Mobilization and Empowerment from the Department of Social Development, as I said, with whom we've worked quite closely. Thank you for availing yourself, and over to you, Mr. Magubane. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, for this opportunity, and to the research that has been presented. So I thought, of course, this is a very critical discussion. I'm in Maritzburg with the minister with a dialogue program. I thought so I just felt, let me just excuse myself and attend this session and return later to the process that we're undertaking with the minister and the MEC. Now, the presentation that I'm happy because it confirms some of the findings of the anti-immigrant sentiment that we find when we do the dialogues in communities, that would normally people say, why do you attack or don't want to be with attitudes towards migrants and refugees? So I think for me, I'm happy that at least the research itself confirms the issues that community members will tell us, especially issues of economy, competition, drugs, and issues of sex and all those things. Those are most of the things that come out of the dialogues, in terms of the dialogues reports that we have. So, but the other thing that, in terms of the presentation, the role of the media, and I know the presenter was saying TV, radio, they've got the critical role. But also my experience is that, although because the TV will report on the activities that are happening and people talking about that, the social media, the influence is that it might be few people, but those people are influencers. They are the one who mobilize and all do that, who have the courage. Some of the things that people will normally not say on TV or radio, they say on Facebook, on social media and all that. So I stay in Thokoza. The recent attacks last year in Pola Park and around Katle Home, those things were not necessarily as a result of media, but they are mostly coming from the activities within Facebook and other social media platforms, where you find that there was a promotion of closing shops and businesses owned by foreign nationals within the community. So as a result, we had a huge number of immigrants coming to Thokoza. So most of the immigrants have run away from most areas in Katlehong. They're in Thokoza, and my worry is that at least now there's a sentiment in social media in Thokoza where they feel that now they are being overwhelmed and all that. Until we act, we might find Thokoza itself. Because when that was happening last year, the Thokoza community stood up and defended and said, we are not going to do this in our community. So those are some, and the social media played a very critical role in that regard. Now, the other connection is the issue of connectivity, Pan-Africanism with the other countries. I think for me personally is the aspect of, and when we discuss the issues of xenophobia in the dialogues, we'll normally say as affluent South Africans that poor South Africans and communities are lazy, they don't want to work, they want to do it because that is why most companies and all that, they would employ migrants than South Africans. And we really tend to forget the role of apartheid in this regard and the damage in terms of mindset. For some of the things of not relating as South Africans with other Africans, it has nothing with being South Africans, but it's the impact of the role of apartheid and the intention that led to the disempowerment of South Africans in terms of the relationship with the continent and all that. So South Africans are, especially Black Africa, we're never traveling people. So most of ourselves who are in the country itself, we know South Africa itself and all, but it's not the doing of South Africans. It is the way the apartheid was designed, was it was working more on the mindset and the psychology of individuals. So when things happen at the moment, we tend to forget where we come from, and we just look at the just above things and say this is because they are lazy and all those. I feel that somehow just some within us in terms of the so-called educated and all that, the ability to engage on what I would call, when we do dialogue, underlying causes, the issue that we call the causes, but they are underlying causes, things that people do not talk about, other things that we normally don't want to talk about. And then the presenter was saying, and the stats for me, that was just surprising because it was saying when the sentiments of those who people who would attack for the foreign nationals in the march and all that. And when you look, it's about 20%. And about 70, more than 70 says, no, they will never march, they will never attack and all that. And the president says, so the sentiments of South Africa being xenophobic, then it says, when we calculate in terms, then because logically, when you do stats, and then you look at the numbers, I would say above 70% of South Africans that says they will never march or attack or do some of the things, and then it tells you another sentiment. But now the question is that when we engage in platform, especially at our level as learned individuals, we tend sometimes to be representing some of the things in terms of what we believe as individuals and rather what the research is saying. I think we need to be engaging practical correctly and say, how do we really interpret these things? The last one I want to talk to is the issue of integration versus reintegration. In 2015, when there was the attacks in KZN, when we went in, I was not happy, and I told them, because we're told to go there and facilitate the reintegration of immigrants into communities where they were staying. And my sentiment was that there's nothing to reintegrate, because from the beginning, they were not integrated in the communities. So in a community where I stay, you've got Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, so they live their life. They are part of the community, they stay in the community, but in terms of attending social care, being part of a community and be integrated, they are not part of that. So those are the things that I think we are trying to do in my community where we are, because my feeling was that I might be working for government, working in other communities, but I stay in Chogoza, which has this issue. So I have to start in the community where I'm staying, using my own resources in trying to do this. So the challenge is that now, how do we bring them so that they become part of a community and they feel that, as we were doing Chogoza, protecting them, that they become seen as part, not as them and us. So for me, there's a critical safety. How do we can come strategies of integrating them and sharing, having with them, sharing the same norms and values within a community that we need to create together and share the same things. That will probably bring us closer to the issue of community cohesive, because I tend to want to talk more of cohesive communities than social, because for me, sociality it's a macro level. But I'm more looking at the community, how community are cohesive. For me, I'm more interested in the work that I'm doing at the moment. We work I want to work community by community. That when we have one community that is cohesive, then you have a number of communities within a region. Then you are able to have that kind of social cohesion we have. But then when we take it at a macro level, we end up talking at that level that we have at the moment as a dialogue. But where things are happening at a community level, those people are not participating. And for me, those are the very critical people whom we need to be engaging in the process. And they are the ones who should be leading, not us leading the process. And they need to take ownership of this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Magubane, and also for availing yourself, given your other commitments, as you've said, there today. So we really appreciate it. The last input or response will be from the South African Human Rights Commission, which, as you know, is a very important Chapter 9 institution, which also has a particular mandate in respect of the NAP implementation in terms of monitoring and advising, and they've also been walking a path with us over the years in terms of finalizing and developing the National Action Plan. So we are looking forward to hearing their input, and the speaker there will be Ms. Omalara Asuni. She is the Research Associate working in the portfolio on the rights of migrants. Thank you so much, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And thank you so much, Stephen, for a very well detailed research. I think it's something that we need to be able to have empirical data to be able to pursue campaigns. And like the chairperson said, that this research is not just based on finding out what the problem is, it's actually finding out how do we address it. And I think one of the things I also picked up was the fact that we can then see where we can channel our first steps of interventions. So if we want to do something on advocacy, we're going to look at TV, for example, and radio. So I like the fact that it's not just problem seeking, but it's also problem solving. I think another thing is that it's also important to then see the stereotypes that has been building. And when you say that media contributed to this, like Mr. Musa also said, what is in media that is contributing to this? And the Commission has seen over time that sometimes it's public figures coming out to also speak on these particular stereotypes and to build on it. It's them also, and then when people look at this thing on TV and they see that this is a public figure that we should believe, who goes to say something like that, it's easier for them to believe that. So there may be a need to see what in TV exactly contributes to that. And I think I like the fact that you also identified that in media, maybe the portraying of some particular African migrants like Nigeria might be the reason there is a high rate of that. But also I'm thinking it might also be because the language barrier. So for Mozambicans, or maybe for Zimbabweans, more importantly, there is not much of a language barrier. There's not much of a you and us, because they can still speak the same, you can still interact with each other. But if it comes from other African continents, they might not be able to even, when they speak, you can tell immediately that they don't speak like you. So that might also be contributing to that particular incidence. I think another thing I would like to also indicate is the fact that the research is beautiful. It has shown clearly that the stereotypes needs to be debunked, and they are not based on empirical facts. But the fact is that there needs to be a way for us to actually break this down to meet the people on the ground, because the stereotypes has been built over time. People have used it as like a blanket. So when there's no social delivery, it's the migrants, like you scapegoat in them. Even public figures that are supposed to be accountable use that as an excuse. So there is a need to be able to break down the figures to people on the ground to be able to understand it, and to be able to make sure that we keep going at it over and over and over again. And I think it's also important to look at the contribution of corruption, because the social delivery is a very big issue in South Africa. And that's one of the reasons when we look at when xenophobic violence starts, it starts with social delivery protests. And then it goes to, okay, let's pick on the person that we can pick next to us. So, and in the commission right now, actually, we are having a conference on the impacts of corruption on human rights. So it might also be important to see that, okay, apart from the fact that these are sentiments that they're having, what is festering those sentiments? Who is allowing it to fester, or how is it being allowed to fester? I think I'm trying to look at other when you were making your research, I was actually noting some things now. So I'm trying to quickly look through what I've written down. I agree with Mr. Musa, and I'd actually noted that down, that in communities, we see communities where people live with migrants. They're their friends, they're their families. But when this violent attacks happen, they turn like almost immediately. And they're the ones going into the shops to loot it. But we've seen communities where they're the ones standing right in front of those doors and saying, no way, you're not coming into this particular place. You're not going to do this to our friends. We might then need to learn from what is working within that community. And like Mr. Musa said, maybe there's an integration. Maybe there is something working well that allows them to become truly integrated, to see that to kill one is to kill all. And I think maybe that might be something that we need to also take a look at, to be able to learn and to be able to know how to integrate societies. And like Mr. Musa did say, integration is really not happening. It's more of, yes, we're just here together. And I already indicated language might be one of the things we might need to look at. Social engagement might be one of the things we need to look at. And over and above that, I also agree with Miss, I think it's, sorry, I can't pronounce your name. Okay, Miss Sisakele, when she said that we need to cost social cohesion, because that might also be a very good way to get everybody on the table. It is very interesting to see DSD here today, to see DAC here today, and to see DOJ. But it's rather sad that DHA is not on the table. And they need to be there because they contribute. And the chairperson had indicated that in his message of support, that we need to work together to be able to achieve this particular dream of social cohesion we want to see. So there needs to even be integration within the government department. There needs to be a common purpose of wanting to actually make sure that the social fiber of the country is actually better than what we see today. And I like the idea of, the fact that the research also indicates that as a country and as a continent, we might be failing each other. I think one of the things we've had with Dr. Leonard Zulu when we spoke was the fact that there needs to be a conversation of how do we ensure that our neighboring countries themselves are in a position to allow people flourish, where there is no need for people to move from one place to the other. So what are we doing as a continent to actually encourage that Pan-Africanism, which is clearly not showing through in the research, because the research went beyond seeing just what South African sentiments are, but what other Africans think about other Africans. So I think it's important to actually take a look at that also. The last thing I would like to speak on is the fact that I feel like sometimes the low rate of arrests, the low rate of prosecution and convictions of perpetrators that commit violent attacks on migrants might actually inform the reason why people are more likely to want to commit them in future. So we might also need to take a look at that. That will be all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Asuni, for those inputs and thoughts. And we have now reached the slot for the Q&A session, where everyone in attendance is able to pose questions on the chat. There's also the Q&A function, so that we can then pick them up and refer them to the appropriate panelists. This session will be handled by myself in collaboration with Mr. Toy, who is handling the chat function. So please feel free, everyone, to pose your questions if there are any. And then I think at this time, while we wait for some questions, perhaps Dr. Gordon would like to just make a few inputs on some of the points picked up by our panelists from the departments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the feedback. Many interesting issues were raised. It's particularly important, I feel, to pick up on Moose's point, that we consider the problem of xenophobia not as the problem of one specific group in South Africa, say Black people or the uneducated. If we look at the public opinion data, we find that many white people, for example, hold strong anti-immigrant views. Many educated people hold strong anti-immigrant views. As someone who's worked in this area for more than 10 years, I can tell you I've come across many people of high rank and education who express very strong anti-immigrant sentiment. So again, we should not try and demonize the poor unjustly for holding anti-immigrant views that are held by many in the country. But I want to touch on something that has come through in a lot of the responses to the presentation, which is the issue of solutions. What can be done to solve this important problem? Now, the speaker who opened our webinar, Dr. Lafloy, clearly articulated the current plan to solve the problem of xenophobia in South Africa, the National Action Plan. The National Action Plan outlines a series of progressive steps to confront this issue, one of the most important being an issue that has arisen in the responses, which is integration programs, immigrant integration programs. The NAP, the National Action Plan, has called for progressive, well-resourced immigrant integration programs in South Africa. The white paper on the international migration legislation, which will soon, if all goes well, become a bill and then an act, has itself articulated clearly that immigrant integration programs are something that South Africa needs. These programs are not a black box, a mystery that cannot be solved. These are programs that many countries throughout the world have adopted, some with more success than others. It is possible to look at best case scenarios, get the benchmarks for what has been done and to hopefully replicate their success. A great exemplar that South Africa perhaps could learn from was Portugal, which has a significant number of international migrants, but is not a wealthy European nation, has implemented a very successful integration program dealing with the large numbers of refugees and cross-border migrants from North Africa who have made Portugal home. These include a wide range of different issues, including customs and language education, access to services, protection from discrimination, and facilities to allow access to labor market and the economy. When making and constructing integration programs, we must not think of them as a gift to foreigners or refugees. These are investments which will yield economic and social benefits in time. Countries which have adopted successful immigration integration programs, such as Canada, New Zealand, and Portugal, have seen economic and social returns to those investments. So again, immigrant integration programs are central to solving many of the problems that we face regarding the issue of xenophobia. And specifically something that the Human Rights Commission has articulated, integration programs involve protection from discrimination. The protection from discrimination, the protection from violence, the protection from harm. And as the Human Rights Commission has articulated, for a variety of different reasons, both attributable to the South African police services and both not attributable to the South African police services, many foreign national communities in South Africa have not received the protection that they need and deserve. I see that I have been speaking for quite some time, so I will perhaps ask the chair if there are specific issues that perhaps we can speak to on this issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. Yes, there are a few questions. I think there was one question from Muluti Firi, just saying that the research, they found the discussions and the research very informative, and that it provides very vital information that can be used as we all work on the issues of xenophobia, and then asking whether it is possible to share the research. So I don't have the link at hand. We can certainly share them, possibly on the chat, but I know that it is available online on the HSRC website, so we can make that available. And I will then ask my colleague Elise to maybe just share some of the suggestions and comments on the chat group. I think there are more comments at this stage than questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Danieline. So we have from Mr. Tabata from the Department of Higher Education and Training. He commented that there is a need for intra-African dialogue to foster collaboration and understanding between African states and citizens. And we definitely take note of that. Thank you, Mr. Tabata. And then Sizakele Shongwe, our panelist from the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, also commented on Mr. Tabata's comment, saying that she supports his suggestion for an African dialogue. And we have attempted to escalate and prioritize social cohesion in the AU agenda. But the sentiment was that issues of xenophobia are South African specific and therefore does not particularly have to be at the top of the AU agenda. The research can strengthen such dialogues and foundational programs in post-school education and training institutions, making the NAP a living document in public institutions too. That was again from Mr. Tabata. And I just want to comment here and say definitely this is something we are taking all the chats with us, and we will respond to them outside of this platform as well, and definitely take up on some of the comments and suggestions that you are making. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you.
I'm further checking.
Okay, thank you. From my side, there is a question here. It reads, do xenophobic attitudes against migrants vary between ordinary South Africans, state employees, or employees in the private sector? If so, what explains this variation or the lack of it? I think this comes from Themba Masuku from APCOF. I wonder if Dr. Gordon would be able to try and respond to that. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, yes. So one of the fundamental issues that we often find in South Africa is while there is a mild differentiation between, say, your educated, high-skilled South Africans and your more low-skilled South Africans on this issue. So high and more educated, so that's high-skilled, more educated South Africans tend to have somewhat more liberal attitudes than low-skilled, less educated South Africans. The differential is not substantially large, however, and sometimes when we are confronted with this problem, the problem of anti-immigrant sentiment, it is very tempting to slip into a materialist discourse in which we attribute the problem almost entirely to one of poverty and unemployment, and say that if only we could solve the issue of poverty and unemployment, then the problem of xenophobia would go away. Indeed, this is a very seductive interpretation because it suggests that there is no special need to pay attention to this issue, and rather we must focus our efforts on economic development. Of course, we should not ignore economic development. Economic development is central to not only the livelihood of all South Africans, but to future generations in our country. And there should be no form which we minimize the importance of job growth, wage growth, and bettering the lives of ordinary people. However, to simply attribute the problem of xenophobia to material conditions is a little problematic. And indeed, we can observe this if we look at the international community. Let us take, for example, the United States. Anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, as we can see at the election of Donald Trump, is quite high, despite enjoying years of record economic growth. The persistence of anti-immigrant views remains strong. Indeed, one can also look at other countries, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, extremely wealthy countries, but also countries in which we see anti-immigrant sentiment, specifically anti-immigrant sentiment that motivates and guides politics. So we cannot reduce this matter almost entirely to one of economics. If we look at some of the main drivers of anti-immigrant sentiment, we must conclude that these drivers are found within the premise of prejudice as a whole. So what we find in South Africa is if people are prejudiced, for example, against other race groups, they tend to be prejudiced against foreign nationals. So issues of international migration should not be separated from issues around racism or indeed homophobia. So it is very, very important for government officials to recognize the fight against xenophobia as part of the larger fight against racism and racial intolerance in our country. These are not separate conflicts, they are part of the same consistent effort. Specifically, when we look at the issue of Pan-Africanism, I would remind our colleagues that South Africa has embarked on a mission of Pan-Africanism to reduce the barriers between African countries, to create a trade-free, visa-free zone on our continent in which goods, services, and people will flow freely as we work towards the creation of a united continent under the African Union's Agenda 2063. In order to achieve that agenda, issues like xenophobia must be tackled.
Thank you so much. There are a few more questions. I'm assuming everyone can follow the comments on the chat group. There is a question here about Internews, or a comment rather, that's from Ngipiwe Nhlangu saying that good afternoon everyone. Internews recently trained 84 SADC journalists on reporting on migration. One of the key challenges we identified was the issue of unconscious bias. I think one can note that anyone of the panel may wish to respond. Then there is another comment or a question here from Mr. Modiri Matthews, I believe from Department of Home Affairs, saying South Africa has made a lot of positive provisions for foreign nationals through exemption permits and a progressive refugee regime. What role do you think other institutions apart from government can play in integration? I'll maybe stop at that point. There are some more questions, but I'll pause for now. Thank you. If Dr. Gordon would like to come in on those questions, I can repeat them if you like.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
One of the most important institutions that can assist in the integration of foreign nationals, and this is something that was touched on in the presentation, are religious institutions. South Africans are people of great faith and deep religious conviction. And because the tenets of the different faiths that South Africans belong to preach compassion and goodwill to all human beings, there should be a reserve of compassionate and welcoming feeling amongst religious institutions for refugees and cross-border migrants. Unfortunately, we do not see this translation from text into action in a lot of cases. It is my belief that religious institutions can play a key role, can be brought in to the fight against xenophobia, inspiring their congregations to both change their minds about refugees and cross-border migrants, as well as assisting in reducing violence and discrimination against these communities. A specific community that emerged from our research was the Zionist movement. The Zionist Church is one of the largest churches in South Africa. Millions of people belong to it. And yet members of the Zionist Church endorse some of the strongest anti-immigrant sentiments amongst all religious groups. If this specific institution could be brought in to combat xenophobia, it might be possible to change hearts and minds amongst this large contingent. There are, of course, other institutions that could play a critical role. In research that is currently being done with the Department of Justice, we were able to identify certain grassroots institutions which South Africans go to solve problems, including ward councils and community meetings. These two important political gatherings are the basis for a lot of politics in poor, underserviced communities. Now, in the past, these institutions have occasionally played a role in mobilizing anti-immigrant activities, but they can just as easily be foundational points to mobilize pro-immigrant activities and to push back against anti-immigrant actions. Indeed, if there was a greater buy-in from grassroots leadership at this level, specifically at the ward councillor level, I believe that substantial progress could be made regarding the fight against xenophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. I'm just encouraging everyone to continue also looking at the chat in the meantime. But I have a question from Dr. Janet here, who says, totally agree with the claim that not all South Africans are xenophobic. How about that which occurs between individual migrants themselves and state-crafted restrictive immigration policies and legislations, and also in public service delivery? So I think it talks about within the migrant community, and then also about within service delivery. And I think that touches on your government departments, your service providers, and perhaps one of the other colleagues from department would like to make a comment, and I'll pause there for now. Thank you. I'm not sure, Dr. Gordon, would you like to reflect on the question about, you know, within the migrant community, and then maybe we'll ask one of the other departments if they'd like to reflect, or even from the Department of Justice, about the public service delivery sort of tendencies within there. Thank you.
Absolutely. So as stated before, you know, South Africa is moving towards a Pan-Africanist vision of a united continent, which means reducing barriers between nations, which will mean a greater level of diversity within our country than we've previously seen. We are, of course, already, as are many other African countries, a very diverse nation. This movement towards Pan-Africanism sometimes conflicts with our current immigration control regime, which has traditionally been very concerned with securitization and the potential negative consequences with immigration and not its more positive consequences. And this kind of conflict, if not resolved, could be an issue in the years to come. To your specific question about the relationships between immigrant communities within South Africa, because of course, as I think we all know, the foreign national community in South Africa is not a holistic, unified community. It's a very diverse community of different languages, different ethnicities, different countries of origin. And whenever you have high degrees of diversity, there is always the potential for conflict and distrust. Indeed, I'm thinking of a recent study which was conducted in the Western Cape on the Congolese community, pointing out distrust within this community between members of the Swahili-speaking community and I think it was the Lugan-speaking community. You can see this as well within other communities, sometimes structured around religion, sometimes structured around language, sometimes structured around questions of ethnicity. And as South Africa confronts issues of xenophobia, of racism, of homophobia, it must also bear in mind its need to address ethnic discrimination, specifically of a tribal nature. We can think, of course, of a recent incident involving a Natabile activist who was asked to leave, I believe, a shopping center due to him wearing traditional attire. And this shows us that there still exists within our nation some uncomfortableness with different ethnic and what could be called tribal presentations of ethno-nationalist identity. And this is an issue which I do not believe will become more prominent over time, but certainly an issue that we as a nation must monitor and make sure that does not create conflict within our society.
Okay, Tanelian, maybe I'd like to come in as well after Doctor's input as well. And I know that you had said that the question is specifically in relation to service delivery. And I know that with the collective that we have here, probably when we're talking about services and service delivery, you're probably wanting to look at specific and pressing issues such as the provision of fuel, electricity, issues around water and sanitation, issues around education, issues around access to land, agriculture, things like that. But I just wanted to speak to our specific portfolio because we are indeed sport, arts and culture. Just to say that as well as we bring in the aspect of the Pan-Africanism, to say that colleagues might be aware that this year as well has been declared by the AU as the year of arts, culture and heritage. So there is going to be a special focus on that. But having said that, then to say that we also have a full understanding that sport, arts and culture is definitely one of the vehicles of promoting social cohesion Now, to say that we do try to, in the work that we do, ensure that we include non-South Africans or foreign nationals in the activities that we do. So whenever we have our activities, we'll ensure that some of the performers, the artists, are indeed some of the non-South Africans. And I want to say that particularly the community we usually work with, especially in KZN, would be the Rwandan community, also in some of the other provinces. So there is that particular approach and at least effort to ensure that we involve them. We are also acutely aware that sport can actually help in preventing conflict, preventing violence as well, in whatever form that it takes. So that's also one of the things that we try to do, to use sport and sporting tournaments and sporting features, just to ensure that we have this element of inclusion, inclusivity, and sort of like integrating. But we definitely do also acknowledge that we need to strengthen that aspect. But the second aspect that I also wanted to look into is what the doctor had said previous to this input that we are now on, to say that in as much as we expect the religious community to contribute towards the integration integration process and so forth, I think they do play their role to a large extent. What I think we need to make a concerted effort on is the inclusion of business and the private sector. Those are the people that really have a vested interest here. And we, I think, are still struggling with how to bring them on board. Because when we talk about social cohesion as cross-cutting and the issues of xenophobia, then certainly the business community has an interest and a stake in this whole thing, whether it's in terms of the destruction of their property, of their businesses, or just making sure that there's kind of like security around that they need to come in. So that lastly then, it talks to part of what I had said about costing, not only costing social cohesion, but also funding social cohesion. So we appreciate the fact that DOJCD has this funding model for the NAP, but we also need to start thinking about developing a funding model for social cohesion, so that right from the top in government, every government department has a budget that has been put aside to advance social cohesion. But also maybe not only just set aside the budget, integrate it into all the programs of that specific department, whether it's science and technology or agriculture and so forth, so that social cohesion is not seen as a standalone. So I think we really need to ensure that we do that. Then we can move to civil society, and we can move to business to see what can they contribute towards the enhancements of social cohesion, just as we're trying to do that through the social compact that needs to be signed with these stakeholders, to say that what are they prepared to do or invest in where social cohesion is concerned. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much for those valuable comments and insights. I have a few more questions, which I will now pose, I think, to the appropriate panelists. And then I will, after that, ask Elise to just share some of the comments on the chat. There is a question, Dr. Lafoy, maybe you could consider. It's actually from GCIS, from Tabisile Dlomo. It's a question to the Department of Justice. And I think it actually can be to anyone for that matter. Is there a way to hold some of the public figures who make anti-xenophobic statements in the public platforms accountable, as these figures are influences on the attitudes of the people on the grassroots level? And I think this is one of those big elephants in the room. It's about political will and example, and it has come through in the research. And then there is a question from Yasmin Raja. She asks, what is the relationship between the challenge of securing documentation, the narrative of the illegal foreigner, and the anti-immigrant sentiment? So I think, Dr. Gordon, this one looks like something that you might want to respond to. And then there's a third question from Kaifus Mahomani, who says that the paper makes a point that of the 24 countries surveyed by Ipsos, South Africa was one of the most hostile countries towards refugees and migrants. So the question is, which indicators influenced the ranking and what rights were being assessed? If you would like to reflect and consider those, while I then go over to Elise just to highlight some of the questions and comments on the chat. Thank you, Elise.
Thank you, Daneline. There was quite a robust discussion on the chat as well, and the research link was shared there. Another person, Annie, mentioned that it will be interesting to conduct a survey with children to see their attitudes towards migrants and the level of friendships developed. And she's saying, I work in a child and youth center and see how children react towards migrant children, and she thinks there's hope. This is good to know. Thank you, Annie. And then Ankini from Salga, I'm not sure, did you read this one, Daneline? The one from
No.
Salga? Okay.
No.
She's saying at Salga, we are guided by the preamble of the Constitution, which states that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. The major challenge which is commonly faced by our member municipalities is when they prepare their integrated development plans because of unaccounted illegal immigrants, which make their job impossible. I would just like to also comment there and say I think we definitely need to involve SALGA in some of the planning and implementation on the NAP. And then further to this, Janet also said that she agrees with the claim that, okay, this was handled, sorry. Hangalagani said the social consequence of COVID-19 for many South Africans, particularly those who have limited participation in the economy, has exacerbated their financial desperation. This situation creates animosity on many people due to their perception that foreign nationals are a threat to the already limited opportunities. And then, do you think this research and its findings will address this problem? So I believe this was more for Stephen. And then there was quite a lot of people who agreed with Mr. Musa Magubani from DSD. And this was like a golden thread throughout the discussion from the opening by Dr. Lefoy until where we are now, that community level engagement, coordination and collaboration, that comes out every now and again. And then Yasmin, I believe that the narrative of illegal foreigner was addressed in the Q&A. And then Musa himself said that there's a need for sensitization training of the police. And there's quite about language, body posture, facilitating anti-xenophobia dialogues. And we know that. We have been mentioning this wherever we go. And that he further said, we then had to take a decision that they also need to be empowered. So this is in their dealings with the police. Maybe to share with you, DSD has been involved. I know Musa had to leave. They have been involved in the Atteridgeville anti-xenophobia campaign, where there was interventions done with community at grassroots level, and we trained change agents. And we're also looking at Katlehong at this time. And then DSD is also very involved in KwaZulu-Natal with everything that goes on there, and they move in and out as the need requires. And then Sizakele also supported the capacity building of the police. Then further, Paul Kabea said that integration is vital if we need to stop xenophobia in the future. However, one of the biggest hindrances of social cohesion is derived from the lack of proper documentation for migrants. How are migrants and refugees supposed to feel accepted when they are constantly reminded by the documentation they use that their stay in the country is temporary, and at the time their asylum status may be, at any time, their asylum status may be rejected regardless of how long they have lived in the country. Then Paul further said, how can the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development nationally support provincial structures such as the KwaZulu-Natal Social Cohesion and Moral Regeneration Movement that intend to facilitate social cohesion but seem stuck with no progress at all? Paul, I'd like to refer you also to the United Nations Protection Working Group, where many departments are part of the structure, and we all participate, and we are all actually in our own way involved in what is happening on the ground in provincial structures and in provinces when xenophobia happens. So we'll definitely follow up with you on this one, Paul. And then Cesar mentioned that Department of Sport, Arts and Culture is already working with the provincial KZM Social Cohesion and MRM Council. And this is exactly what I'm saying. Cesar herself is also a member of the UNPWG, and this is a place where we all join and we reach out to provinces. Then it was also said by Wonga Tabata that the business community involvement is critical and system-wide budgets. And that is about it for this one then. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elise. Can I then ask Dr. Lafoy, Dr. Gordon, to just briefly respond to those questions I posed earlier? There are two more questions that I will then come to after this, and I think it's just after that point we will start looking at wrapping up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So there's a hanging question that you put to the Department of Justice concerning discrimination in service delivery, which is also connected to one of the comments in the chat that was made concerning facilitation of anti-xenophobic and anti-racism programs where SAPS officials, specific reference was made to SAPS officials through their body language and conduct, apparently convey that they themselves have anti-xenophobic sentiments. It's a complex issue, and it's the question that we are all involved in answering in the research, in the work that we are doing in the Department of Justice, in the work that the Department of Social Development is doing. And I alluded to it in my opening when I commented on the 25 years that have passed since we implemented the Constitution. And this project that we are engaged in to inculcate a democracy that is based on constitutionalism, human rights, and respect for the rule of law. So we shouldn't divorce the efforts of government from the actual condition in society. The officials who work in government departments are also expected to display some of the attitudes that the research has indicated, which means that we as government can and do direct our efforts towards public education campaigns directed at the attitudes of government officials themselves. And so there is that on the level of addressing perceptions and attitudes, that work that is being done, that needs to be done, that incrementally we move everybody towards acceptance of the human rights norms such as anti-racism and xenophobia. So that's on the perceptions side of that question of discrimination in service delivery. And then we also have to address the policy side, that if there are government policies or legislation which run counter to our obligations in terms of international regional instruments, the Constitution and legislation, that incrementally those are also addressed if necessary through court action. And an example which comes to mind is the recent decision considering the extension of the right to register undocumented migrant children in primary education, which the Department of Education has extended that decision, which happened in a particular division of the High Court, to extend the right to all undocumented children who seek admission into public schools. So that's on the policy side as well. And then moving to the other question, Daneline, that was posed by GCIS concerning holding public officials to account. We do have legislation in place in Perpuda, and we also have a very prominent example of that currently making its way through the courts, and we are awaiting the decision of the Constitutional Court in the Kelani matter. And also there is the mooted hate crimes legislation, which is sort of hanging while we wait for that Constitutional Court decision. But the short answer to the question is yes, there is a way to hold people accountable for public expression of racist, xenophobic, homophobic comments, and that is the Perpuda legislation, and there is also the Equality Court. So I don't know if Ms. Fransman or Mr. Toy or any of the other panelists would like to add to that response.
Yeah. Okay, Daneline, maybe if I can come in briefly as well. I know that we're moving towards conclusion of sorts, and I just want to take up from back to front the comment that was just made about by the DDG, to say it was exactly the sentiment that I wanted to make, to say that without particularly putting DOJCD on the spot, but I would think that the issue of holding public figures accountable will talk to the issue of hate speech, and therefore the hate and crimes bill will have to come into place. But to say that, you know, that becomes very tricky as well for so many reasons, because firstly, you need to make sure that your enforceability tool is really in place, and which is our piece of legislation. But you really have to make sure that it has the teeth, because you'll find that in other instances, perhaps a fine has been suggested, you know, or an apology to be issued, but then people will actually budget for a fine. And so it fits the whole purpose. But I think those are some of the things that we need to look at when we talk about the issues of enforceability and enforceability tools that we need to put in place. And also to be sure that who really leads in this area, because we don't particularly want to put it all on the shoulders of DOJCD. I think as the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, leading and coordinating social cohesion as well, it would be our responsibility to call out somebody as well who makes such statements. So yeah, it was just my beat there in relation to the issue of holding people accountable.
Thank you, Sizakele, Ms. Shongwe. I believe, Dr. Gordon, there were still one or two questions that you may want to reflect on before I think we then move to closing this session on the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a number of questions put forward. So firstly, on the cross-national slide, which referenced Afrobarometer data from their 7th round, in which they asked people in that international survey, would you like or dislike to live next to a immigrant or foreign worker? And so that is the basis on which that slide was conducted. Now, that data has been subject to advanced statistical analysis to identify those macro level characteristics which most predict the variance in attitudes that we did see. It's a very interesting subject. I worry we don't really have the time now, so I kind of encourage you to reach out to me to really discuss that further. To say very quickly, attitudes of this kind are not related to the presence of international migrants in a specific country. They are correlated with economic growth, but in a positive way, indicating that richer African countries tend to be more hostile than poorer African countries. And there does seem to be a correlation between membership or participation in regional economic communities and levels of prejudice observed. But again, I would love for you to reach out to me and discuss this matter further at another time, because there are two more questions I want to get to. So the first one is illegal migration. So illegal migration is one of the most prevalent stereotypes in South Africa. So I do not have time to really go into it during the presentation, but there is the belief that there are tens of millions of undocumented migrants living in South Africa, a sort of outlandish and baseless stereotype. Indeed, the recent president of Action SA has made a claim that there were 15 million undocumented migrants. Again, a baseless myth, but well believed by the public, in which more than half the adult population seems to endorse these types of myths. Deeply worrying, and something we really need to push back on. Regarding COVID-19 and the recent economic distress, the Human Science Research Council is currently conducting research on this very question, having gathered data before the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, as well as after our most recent shutdown came to an end in February of this year. And so we will be able to use that data to analyze how COVID-19, the lockdown, and the economic hardships of our current time have affected attitudes. So I would encourage you to pay attention to this space where that data will be released and discussed. So we are always trying to work through these difficult questions as the Human Science Research Council. I hope I have, on the issue of undocumented migration and policy, there's one more thing I'd like to say. The South African government, as you've heard me say before, has committed itself to a Pan-Africanist vision of continental unity under the African Union's Agenda 2063. And this means putting an end to the regional barriers would make certain population groups undocumented. And I would encourage the Department of Home Affairs, as well as various government departments, to keep this in mind as we work towards this very important goal that the South African government under President Cyril Ramaphosa has committed us to. We will be working towards a future within the next 50 years in which almost all migrants in South Africa will be documented, regardless of how they entered the country. And I think this is very important to keep in mind as we try and build a Pan-Africanist spirit and Pan-Africanist sentiment in our nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, colleagues, panelists, we have tried to do our best to respond. Some of these are not easy one-word answer questions, but I think we will reflect when we deal with the way forward, how we envisage to, in a way, to respond and take this first webinar process forward. There was just a question which I'm not sure was responded to. Elise has indicated that she may respond on the chat about the issue of unconscious bias within journalism and how that leads to problematic framing of migration issues. And I do not want to put anyone on the spot, but I just wondered if they're from the Human Rights Commission or UNHCR wanted to respond to that. I know that from our work on the NAP, we have acknowledged the important role that the media plays. And just like public officials or public figures out there, it is important to walk the talk, to be sensitized, to be more, sort of diversity training, that kind of thing. I know that the Commission has done some years ago research and issued a report on racism in the media, also a number of public hearings held. If you would like to respond to that, but if all the questions are not fully responded to, then at least we will outline the process towards the end of the program on how we intend to address this. So if I may ask, any indication from UNHCR or SAHRC? Thank you.
Yes, I can participate here now. I think we have worked very well with the media in South Africa, in particular in the wake of incidents of violence against foreigners, or where refugees are being perceived to be behaving badly, such as when we've had protests, the protests that we had in Pretoria and Cape Town. I think the media interest was very high, and the way it was being reported was quite constructive. There has to be a constant dialogue between us practitioners in the social cohesion space, a human rights space, and the media to explain the predicament of asylum seekers, refugees, the plights of migrants in the country and the challenges that they face. So this constant dialogue has to be there. Journalists are human beings, they have their biases, but we do have professional communicators on board in UNHCR who engage and relate with the media. And importantly, also the social media. That's a growing space. A lot of hate speech is propagated in social media by various groups around the country, just like in any other country as well. So I think the role of the media is really key and quite important. And I also saw the other question here on international comparisons. I think that's quite important to bring that in, that dimension in, to learn from others around the world, because this issue is not unique to South Africa, and many other countries are also grappling with the same issues. So an international exchange could be helpful, and an organization such as UNHCR could help bring that perspective in when we are having a dialogue such as the one that we are having. So thank you very much. Very interesting. I stayed anchored to my chair here, following all the discussions. I enjoyed myself very much. And thank you very much, Dr. Gordon and your team, for this important research and survey. The results was spot on, I think, from what we've been observing as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zulu. I wanted to hear if there was any final inputs from the Human Rights Commission. If not, then we will move on to the next segment.
In addition, I think we've also worked on media and racism and xenophobia, and we've realized that sometimes it's just boiling down to understanding the biases, as was indicated in the comment section. But sometimes also it's the fact that, like when we had a hearing with Facebook, Twitter, with social media generally, because we actually received eight slurs from media where we pick it up or people report it to us, and then we then need to take it up, investigate and mediate, or sometimes actually take it to the Equality Court. Is the fact that sometimes there are two sides of it. The first thing is that the social media is just a reflection of who we are. But the truth of it is that the anonymity and the fact that you feel like you cannot be reached also then makes us to be more bold or emboldened. So we've discussed with the social media platforms to find out from them in our hearing, what can they do to actually mitigate, to identify these issues. One of the problems they indicated was the fact that it's difficult to know what racial slurs are in one continent or in one country from the other. And then the idea was you need to put in research to ensure that, because like in the US, for example, the N-word would be a racial slur. And then in South Africa, the K-word would be a racial slur. So the intention was to make sure that their content advisors are actually local, so they can pick it up on time. Number two, to also make sure they do proper research to include those words in those in their list of words that wouldn't be published or would be taken down. So I think we are working with, we've worked with them and we've spoken to them about it. We are aware of the fact that the media, much more than just the TV and the traditional medium, but also including social media, actually plays a large role to increase the level of hate around. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those reflections. And then without further ado again, it's Dr. Gordon, your turn to kindly just, I think, summarize some of the recommendations from your survey and just very high level, summary. I wouldn't say way forward because that is what Elise will do after your slot, but really just to focus on the recommendations for us going forward from here. Thank you.
Well, firstly, I would like to thank everyone who attended this webinar. I think it has been extremely productive. The comments have been very constructive. The dialogue has been very open and honest, and I feel confident that as Elise will outline the way forward, we'll be moving towards a tangible and progressive outcome to this webinar. So I want to thank you upfront right now. In terms of a summary of the recommendations moving forward, they are quite diverse, but we can conclude that they consist of the following: the importance of immigrant integration programs to social cohesion and the investment and well-resourced nature of such programs is key. Secondly, communication campaigns targeted at those groups most susceptible towards moving to a liberal and tolerant position on refugees and immigrants, and the data provided shows you those categories of individuals to target. Secondly, the importance of the broadcast media as a trusted source of information, a platform through which progressive content on social cohesion and anti-xenophobia can be put forward. And then finally, a recognition of the need to introduce, cultivate, and promote Pan-Africanist values and spirits within ordinary South Africans, so they feel connected to people outside of South Africa towards their brothers and sisters on the African continent. There are other recommendations that will be encompassed as part of this report moving forward. I believe Annalise will outline the way forward and how that will be done. But again, I would like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. I'm now going to hand over to Elise du Toit, who will just briefly deal with the way forward and resolutions, I think, from our discussions, just so that everyone does not also leave here feeling that, you know, what next, where to now, just to speak to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danieline. Maybe just to highlight quickly, as I said before, some of the issues that we picked up through the discussion was community involvement, working on a grassroots level, collaboration and coordination of our efforts. And this is something that the DOJ has been doing with all of you that's in this on this platform. And then further to this, just to mention that Dr. Gordon, Stephen agreed to do a policy brief for us flowing from this research. And we will definitely, this webinar is not a once-off, we did not tell you before, but we will definitely come back and share with you again and hear your views. Especially, we would like to have a discussion, a focused discussion with government departments on the policy brief once it's available. And thank you, Stephen, for that. He is so willing to always share and to contribute to our work. And then further to this is also to bring civil society and the UN agencies back to this platform to further discuss and unpack what we've done today. And then also, as Dr. Lefoy has mentioned, this is the year when we celebrate the World Conference Against Racism, as well as the 25-year anniversary of the Constitution. And there will also be activities from our department with our stakeholders on that. Further then also to put you at ease that I did copy all the chats and the questions as well as the answers already, and we will follow up on that. And if need be, and it has to go to one of our sister departments, we will forward to them and we will generate a reply and send to you by email. I believe in a nutshell, this is where it is. And then there was a further question. Will we share with you the recording of this event? We will do so once it's available. And yes, I think that's about it from my side. Thank you, Danieline.
Thank you very much, Elise. So I think what remains to be done is for me to do the vote of thanks and closure. I'm looking at the time and I think we are just within our scheduled time. So firstly, to all our esteemed and valued speakers who availed yourselves, your time, your expertise to support this event, and of course, more importantly, is to, going forward, continue our collaboration on addressing these issues as part of our work. Also to the HSRC, to Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for agreeing to partner with us. This is our first really virtual event, so it is also a bit of a first for us in many ways. Comes with all sorts of different stresses with the logistics and all that, but I think fortunately technology and ESCOM, everything was on our side today. So thank you so much for that. To the GCIS for your technical support. We would not have been able to do this without all your assistance. Importantly, to everyone who made time to participate and engage on this platform, thank you for that. It can only, strengthen our interventions and just make our work more effective. And then to everyone, behind the scenes, the small team that we have who really worked around the clock to finally make this happen. Thank you so much. And as indicated, I believe recordings will be made available for you to refer to. And this will be hopefully the first of many similar engagements. So to all of you, thank you very much for your time, for your participation, for your support, and I wish you a good afternoon further, and declare that this webinar is now closed. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you.